Climate change. So in this lesson, we're going to be, so students, by the end of it, students should be able to illustrate how Earth processes and human factors influence Earth's climate, evaluate effects of climate change, and initiatives that attempt to address those effects. So that's what we're going to look at in this lesson. So the intentions then are understand the terms climate and weather, so what's meant by that, factors that affect the climate, these things called greenhouse gases, the greenhouse effect, combustion of fossil fuels, agricultural greenhouse gas production, the enhanced greenhouse effect, the effects of global warming, and evidence for global warming and climate change, initiatives to reduce factors causing climate change, and then in class we'll look at some activity to demonstrate the effect of greenhouse gases. So that's what we're going to look at now. We're going to look at this idea of climate change and what that's about, and how the factors that impact climate change, and then some of the things that need to be done in order to address climate change. So climate and weather. So weather is the short-term changes in the atmosphere, such as temperature, rainfall, wind, and humidity that happens each day. So every time you get up in the morning and you look out the window, you're getting a glimpse of the weather, the way that it is. So it might be a hot day, it might be raining, could be pretty windy, or it could be a combination of all of these. Weather is different in different regions of the world and can change very quickly as well. So the temperature here in Ireland and the weather here in Ireland is very different to the weather, for example, in Africa. And that's because of its position on the globe. Climate describes what the weather is like over a long period of time. So weather is just like what you see, when you look outside over a short period of time, but climate describes what the weather is like over a long period of time in a specific area. So, we might say in Ireland, for example, it's raining all the time, okay? But that's an example of what we mean by climate. So different regions tend to have different climates. So again, depending on where the country is on the globe, that will have a big impact on the climate that's going to happen there all the time. So if you think about on the North Poles, for example, like the climate is going to be pretty cold, so it is, and that's going to be consistent over a long period of time. So when scientists talk about climate, they're often looking at averages of rainfall. They're looking at averages of temperature. Averages of humidity is just the amount of water vapor that's in the air, sunshine, and wind over many years. So that's when we talk about the climate, that's what they're looking at. So if we have a look at our graphic here as well, so some of the things that scientists will measure, so they will measure the temperature of the ocean, okay, and they'll monitor that over a long period of time. So sea surface temperature. They will look at things like the sea level, so for example, the level of the sea. They look at sea ice, so the size of sea ice. So if like ice is melting, that indicates a change in the climate. If the sea temperatures are increasing, that indicates that something's going on. There's ground stations then that might measure the temperature of the ground. There's things that would measure wind speed and humidity. So there's going to be sensors, for example, all over the world. They might look at things like solar radiation as well, so that it'll measure the amount of radiation that we're getting from the sun. They will look at snow-covered areas and look at them using a satellite and see, how has that changed over a period of time. And with things like the International Space Station, humans now are actually able to look at and measure these different changes in climate over across the globe. So global climate then is a description of the climate of a planet as a whole. That's what we mean by global climate. So overall, global climate depends on the amount of energy received from the sun. So essentially what's happening is the amount of energy that we receive from the sun, that has a massive impact on global weather and global climate. So if we think about global global climate is in relation to the globe. Now, factors that affect the regional climate. So if you think about the particular region that you live in, so what are some of the factors that impact on that? Latitude or distance from the equator. So in areas closer to the poles, so for example up here or down here, sunlight has a larger area of atmosphere to pass through, and the sun is at a lower angle in the sky. As a result, more energy is lost and temperatures are cooler. So up here in the poles, for example, uh, the light from the sun is spread out. It's not hitting the earth directly. The earth is slightly tilted at an angle. So as a result of that, and also as well the fact that it has to pass through larger areas of atmosphere, the temperatures up here are going to be much lower. Now, in contrast to that, if you think about the equator, so all along the equator, the sun is hitting directly onto the surface of the earth along the equator. So as a result of that, you get tropical regions, okay, that are pretty, the temperatures are pretty high, so they are. So prevailing winds, if the prevailing wind is from the ocean, it can bring moist air and more rainfall. So again, depending on, there's wind currents that move all around the globe, and depending on where a region is in relation to it, that can have a massive impact on the climate in that area. Altitude or height above sea level, so higher locations have colder temperatures, and temperatures usually decrease by 1 degrees for every 100 meters in altitude. So as the land mass it's higher above sea level, it gets colder. So roughly 1 degrees, there's a decrease, or 1 degree drop in temperature for every 100 meters. So if you think about in the Himalayas, or if you think about Mount Everest, for example, up on those high peaks, it's pretty cold. So it is because you're high up above the sea level. Distance from the sea. So oceans heat up and cool down much slower than land. So this means that coastal locations tend to be cooler in summer and warmer in the winter. So water, for example, takes a lot longer to heat up and cool down than, for example, landmass. So these are some of the factors that can influence a region's climate. And you can see here, if you look across the globe, so you have these different types of climate. So for example, up here in the north, in the polar regions, it's pretty cold. Here along the continental regions, it's a mixture between being cold and being like freezing, and then being warm. Then you have, so for example, these areas here are generally going to be temperate or dry. So these regions here, and then as you get to the equator, it's going to be, you're talking like fairly hot and tropical conditions that happen along these positions. So again, this is all dictated by the amount of light or sun energy that hits these areas of the earth. So in relation to the climate then as well, there's an important effect that happens also. So we have an atmosphere around our earth, and we get this thing called the greenhouse effect. So greenhouses are like glass sheds that keep heat in, and they allow you to grow plants, for example, that need that kind of environment to grow in. So the greenhouse effect. We also get this greenhouse effect on the earth as well. It kind of keeps temperatures at a level that we want, that enables life to exist on the earth. So solar energy, which is short wave radiation, is absorbed at the earth's surface, and it's radiated back into the atmosphere as heat. So what's happening is, so the heat from the sun, so you get this UV light, which is a short wave radiation. So radiation travels in a wave, and what happens is it penetrates down through the atmosphere and it heats up the earth. And then what happens then is the heated earth then bounces the heat back up through the atmosphere and then back out into space. So this normal process allows the earth to heat up and keep its a temperature and that enables us to be able to survive on the earth. As the heat makes its way through the atmosphere and back out to space, some of it is absorbed by gases such as carbon dioxide. So as the heat is passing back out, some of the heat is reflected back or absorbed back down to the earth by greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. These gases, known as greenhouse gases, can radiate the heat back to the Earth's surface. So this process maintains the Earth's temperature at around 33 degrees Celsius, warmer than it would otherwise be, allowing life on the Earth to exist. So if we didn't have this effect, like the Earth would be pretty cold and would probably be too cold for life to exist on the Earth. So this is what's known as the greenhouse effect. So there's all different types of greenhouse gases that make up this layer of atmosphere around the Earth. So greenhouse gases include water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane. So these gas molecules consist of 3 or more atoms that vibrate when they absorb heat, and in turn release heat back near the Earth's surface. So if we think about these particular greenhouse gases, so they have a particular structure. So for example, methane is made up of, it has carbon, and then it's attached to 4 hydrogen atoms, and it has this covalent bond that holds them all together like so. So that's kind of like what methane looks like. Carbon dioxide is a carbon, and then it has 2 oxygen covalently bonded to the carbon as well. Okay, that's why it's called carbon dioxide, because you have these 2 oxygens. And then water vapor is just an oxygen connected to 2 hydrogens. So you have these bonds, for example, that are between the atoms, and they're called covalent bonds. And what can happen is for example, when methane, or when any of these molecules, when heat, so let's say you get heat from the sun, so heat, what happens is these bonds, they start to vibrate. So they absorb the heat, and then they can reflect the heat back out. So that's what can kind of happen. And these are what are known as greenhouse gases. So essentially what they can do is they can absorb the heat and reflect it back. So when you have the Earth, so you have the Earth like so, and then around the Earth then you have this atmosphere that's made up of, it's made up of oxygen as well, O2. It's made up of water vapor, and it's made up of nitrogen. Okay, and then it's also made up of these greenhouse gases. And what that does is it forms an atmosphere around the Earth. So heat from the sun can pass into this, and then what happens is it can pass back out again. But sometimes what can happen is if there's too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, what will happen is the heat will be reflected back down to the Earth as well. So this can be a problem because it can cause the global temperatures to increase across the globe. Carbon dioxide makes up a small fraction of the atmosphere, but has a large effect on climate. Methane is able to absorb far more heat than carbon dioxide, but it does break down in the atmosphere after a number of years. Wetlands are a large natural source of methane. The atmosphere of Venus contains high levels of carbon dioxide, which causes a very high greenhouse effect, raising the temperatures of Venus higher than that of Mercury. And Mercury is, if you remember, it's one of the planets that's very close to the sun. But because Venus has an atmosphere of carbon dioxide, temperatures are pretty hot on Venus then as well because of that. So these greenhouse gases can be a problem. So greenhouse gases emissions share by sector. So for example, these gases are produced all the time through many different ways. Okay, so if we think about when we're growing our food and making our food in agriculture, that, like you can see here, that contributes to a big amount of greenhouse gases, and we look at that. So when we want to get rid of waste, so again, that contributes to like CO2 and greenhouse gases being produced. So energy industries, so for example, like mining coal and taking oil out of the ground, for example, that we use up a lot of energy, and we actually produce a lot of greenhouse gases in that process then as well. So just in residential areas, so people just living, heating their homes, cooking their foods, energy being produced, and that all results in greenhouse gases being produced. So manufacturing, so for example, when you have to like manufacture raw materials that we use to build our societies, these all produce greenhouse gases. So this is just kind of a breakdown from in Ireland, for example, like some of the ways that or the sectors that produce greenhouse gases. So obviously what we want to try and do over time is to limit the amount of greenhouse gases that we as humans are producing by working greener and working smarter in relation to making all of the materials and providing the services that we need in order to keep society a place that we want to live in. But again, it has a knock-on effect because we are producing all of these greenhouse gases and they can have a massive impact on global temperature and global weather systems. So a big thing that we do is we burn fossil fuels. So we use this is like the basis of what's called the Industrial Revolution. So since we learned how to, you know, make the combustion engine, we've been burning fossil fuels in order to do all of the different things that we want to do. Like for example, driving cars, like power stations are fueled using this process of burning fossil fuels. So fossil fuels such as coal, oil and natural gases are created when organic matter decays and becomes compressed beneath layer upon layer of sand, earth, rock and ocean. So it takes a long time for these fossil fuels to be formed. Um, During combustion, these fuels combine with oxygen and release heat. So they can be burned then to produce heat and to turn an engine, and we use them to get all different types of work done. So fossil fuels are composed primarily of hydrocarbons, molecules of carbon and hydrogen, which are converted into carbon dioxide and water and other compounds during a combustion reaction. So this here is like a chemical reaction. So on the left hand side you have the reactants, on the right hand side you have the products. So if you take methane, for example, and you burn it in air with oxygen, it produces a huge amount of energy in the form of light and heat, and the byproducts of that are greenhouse gases such as water vapor, so it produces water vapor, and carbon dioxide. And this is kind of like what it looks like as well. So if you take methane and you burn it with oxygen, it produces carbon dioxide and water vapor. So combustion of fossil fuels, this is a massive contributor to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So where can, and methane, remember as well, methane is also a greenhouse gas. So if we take agriculture then, so this is a massive, as we've seen in the pie chart previously, there's an awful lot of greenhouse gases produced through the process of agriculture. So agriculture accounts for the majority of methane emissions in Ireland due to the dominance of cattle and sheep livestock in like the agricultural setup that we have here in Ireland. So these animals release methane as a byproduct of bacterial action in their stomachs and large intestines. So the manure that cattle and other grazers produce is also a site of fermentation, which also produces methane. Also as well a massive, so if you take rice production, so in China, for example, they have massive rice fields. So rice production is another significant source of methane. Methane gas is produced from flooded rice fields by bacteria in the waterlogged soil as well. So if we look at this process here as well, okay, so this is a cow, so it is eating grass, for example, its food, and what happens is in its stomach there's this fermentation process that happens. So the fungi and bacteria in the stomach, what they do is they start to break down the grass, for example, and they take like sugars and they break it down. They break these sugars or carbohydrates down into carbon dioxide and methane. And then what happens is this methane leaves the animal, and as a result of that, that methane that is produced in the animal's stomach is then released into the atmosphere, and it goes up and it forms part of the atmosphere. And as we know, methane is a greenhouse gas. Now what can happen is this natural process here, like we talked about, the greenhouse effect, where the sun comes down, heats up the earth, and then some of that heat energy then can leave the earth back through the atmosphere and out into space. This keeps the temperature on the Earth at a level that's acceptable, that we can actually thrive and live in. But the problem is that as we produce more and more greenhouse gases, what happens is this: it interferes with this natural greenhouse effect. And what can happen is you can have this enhanced greenhouse effect that can happen. So instead of like a lot of the heat being able to escape out into space, what happens is that gets reflected back down into the Earth, and it starts to increase the overall global temperature, and less of that heat is able to escape out into the atmosphere, out into space. So as a result of that, it starts to increase temperatures on the Earth. So the enhanced greenhouse effect is the impact on the climate from additional heat retained due to increased amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that humans have released into Earth's atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So we're slowly increasing the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, and as a result, it's interfering with this normal process here, and it's creating this enhanced greenhouse effect. So it's essentially increasing global temperatures. So since the mid-1800s, the average concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere has risen from about 280 parts per million to just over 383 parts per million in 2007, and methane from about 800 parts per billion to around 1,790 parts per billion in 2008. So you can see there's these dramatic increases in the amount of these methane gases that are in the atmosphere. So the average global temperature on Earth has increased by more than 1 degree Celsius since 1880. 2/3 of the warming has occurred since 1975 at a rate of roughly 0.15 to 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. So what's happened is the overall temperatures across the Earth is gradually increasing bit by bit as we move on. So what's the big deal with the temperatures are getting warmer? Well, the problem with that is that it can cause all kinds of problems and unpredictable weather systems across the globe. So global warming refers to the rise in global temperature due mainly to the increased concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So a rise in global temperature by 1 or 2 degrees will affect global rainfall, ocean circulation, and may lead to extreme weather events such as hurricanes and snowstorms. So it just messes up the whole weather system. An increase in global temperature is causing glaciers to melt and oceans to warm and expand in volume, leading to coastal flooding. So it reduces the amount of land mass that's available. And if you're some of the people that live close to the sea, for example, this can have a major impact on your life. So global ocean levels have risen by 19 centimeters in the last century. So slowly but surely, sea levels are starting to increase. Increased carbon dioxide dissolved in oceans causes ocean acidification, which removes carbonate ions needed by mussels, crabs, coral, and other sea life to form shells as well. So again, this excess greenhouse gas like carbon dioxide, what starts to happen is it starts to get dissolved into the sea, and that changes the chemistry of the sea, and it results in these carbonate ions, animals that are part of the ecology in the sea, so mussels, crabs, and other sea life, it can produce its shell, and as a result of that, you can get whole coral reefs that start to die off, and that has a massive impact then on 50% of our oxygen comes from the sea. So if you're messing with the chemistry in the sea and you're killing the organisms in the sea, that will directly impact on us then as well. So this is Trift Glacier in Switzerland. So we can see so here on the left is what it looked like in 2006. And then on the right then on the right then is what it looks like in 2015. So you can see that there's a huge change there. These glaciers are melting, and that body of water then is going back into the groundwater, and it's also going back into the sea, and it's increasing water levels across the globe. So this is when you look at things like this, you can see the massive effect it's having on global temperatures increasing. So evidence for global warming and climate change. So the picture that we looked at there, that's like kind of like one form of evidence where like people can look at and they can see these changes that are happening. So Earth's temperatures vary among regions of the globe and between seasons, but average temperature all over the world is shown an upward trend since reliable records began. So what's happening is, we can see here the yellow line. So as the carbon dioxide levels are increasing, okay, we can also see that there's a steady increase in global temperatures then as well. So that's like an average temperature of the whole globe. And that's over a region from 1880 up to 2013. So temperature records kept over the past 150 years show Earth's average temperature has risen more than 0.9 degrees Celsius. So analysis of trapped air bubbles in polar ice core samples show that the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere was far lower thousands of years ago. So they can look at they can take cores of ice and they can look at the amount of these greenhouse gases that are dissolved in it, and that gives an indication of the levels of these greenhouse gases that were in the atmosphere back during those times. And it's shown that there was less greenhouse gases in the atmosphere back then. So these ice cores show major growth in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels in the industrial period as well. So humans started to learn how to take fossil fuels out of the earth and how the combustion engine and how to burn them and produce CO2. That's great for industry, but it has an impact on the climate, and it has on the environment as well. So that's the kind of evidence that shows that this global warming is happening across the globe. So what are some of the things that can be done in order to try and prevent this from happening? So initiatives to reduce factors causing climate change. So what are some of the things that we can do? So the Paris Agreement, which is 2016, and the COP26 agreement in 2021 are agreements between 180 countries to avoid climate change by limiting global warming to below 2 degrees by reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% by 2030 compared to 1990. So in order to reduce the amount of CO2 that's been produced, countries have signed up to these agreements to limit the amount of greenhouse gases that are being produced. So what are some of the things that they're doing? So they have like a carbon tax, is a tax placed on carbon content of fuel in order to encourage alternative energy use. So fuels like petrol, for example, would be carbon taxed because when you burn them, you're producing CO2. So that's one way that they can do it. In Ireland, the carbon tax adds around €3 to a bag of coal and around €70 to a fill of home heating oil in your tank. Okay, so it's basically taxing the use of these fossil fuels. So the money collected through the carbon tax has been used to fund investments in low carbon energy production. So again, we're all the time trying to look at alternative ways to produce energy. We need energy in order for society to function. At the moment, we're using fossil fuels to produce a lot of our energy, but governments are all the time looking at initiatives to try and look at alternative ways to produce energy. And if you can come up with an alternative way to produce energy, you'll be a very wealthy individual. So individuals can contribute to recycling greenhouse gas emissions by choosing locally produced foods with low carbon miles. So and by using energy efficient, so using energy efficient electrical devices, and individuals can also engage in local and political advocacy around issues of climate change as well. So we can see here Greta in Sweden, so she's an environmental activist and she's promoting the views that humanity is facing a crisis arising from global climate change. So again, these are things that we can all do. We all have to live on this planet, so we have to look at looking after it and protecting what we have and protecting the environment. So an activity that we'll do in the lab, so this is one where it demonstrates the greenhouse effect. So if you add a little water to 2 litre, and you can do it at home if you have the equipment. So add a little water to 2 bottles, to 2 litre bottles, and place a thermostat in each bottle. add an Alka-Seltzer tablet to one bottle. So the tablet reacts with water to release carbon dioxide. So you get that chemical reaction and you get carbon dioxide being produced. So you place the lamp in front of the bottles to provide a radiant heat source and record the temperature of the air inside each bottle over an hour. So the temperature inside the bottle with the carbon dioxide has risen more, showing that carbon dioxide is very efficient at trapping heat. So what will happen is you'll have one that doesn't have these greenhouse gases in being produced and one that does. And what you'll find is that the one that has the Alka-Seltzer in it, that the temperature, it'll increase in temperature, it'll get much hotter than the one that doesn't. And that shows how carbon dioxide is a really good insulator. It keeps the heat in, and it has that same effect when it's in the atmosphere around our globe as well. So that's everything that we wanted to look at. So by the end of it then, so let's think back. So students should be able to illustrate how Earth processes and human factors influence Earth's climate. So Earth processes, so you have the greenhouse effect that happens, you have this atmosphere that keeps in the heat. Human factors influence this by producing greenhouse gases such as methane and carbon dioxide, goes up into the atmosphere and it causes an enhanced greenhouse effect to happen. Earth's evaluate the effects of climate change. So some of the effects that climate change can have is that sea levels increase, overall global temperatures increase. That can have a massive impact on weather. And some are the initiatives that attempt to address those effects. And we looked at, for example, the governments can put carbon taxes on, and certain countries have agreements to limit the amount of greenhouse gases that are being produced as well. So these are some of the learning outcomes that we've looked at in relation to climate change.